After a month of fighting that's left thousands dead and sent millions on the run, Moscow says it's shifting its focus to Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. While the Kremlin claims it's successfully completed the first phase of what it calls its military operation, analysts say it could be a sign Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to save face after failing to subdue Ukraine or capture its capital, Kyiv. But as Moscow changes focus, the human tragedy of the invasion shows no sign of abating.
Signs of spring greeted Kyiv on Saturday as Ukraine shakes off its winter and enters a new phase of war. There may be a change in strategy after Russian defeats, but there's little respite for those on the front lines of battle. Many are visibly exhausted but steadfast in their determination to stay. Putin came, as you can see, he says. Our children and grandchildren are dying. I'm 62. I can't leave this place. I'll stay here. If need be, I will die here. But I will not give them Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have recaptured areas on the outskirts of the capital, Kyiv. Still, lives continue to be destroyed. At this hospital in Kharkiv, the wounded continue to arrive as Ukrainian forces come under heavy fire. In Mariupol, the damage inflicted by Russian bombs is clear. Unfortunately, nothing remains of Mariupol, and they're bombing it with savage weapons. This last week there have been explosions like I've never heard before. They hit residential areas with rockets. Hundreds continue to flee Mariupol, saying goodbye to their decimated city and to those who must stay behind.
Well, let's bring in DW correspondent Nick Conley, who's in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Hi, Nick. Good to see you. Now, despite the fact that Russia has said it will focus on the eastern Donbas region, we understand that war is still raging in the south, in the cities of Mariupol and Kherson. Can you give us more on that?
I think there are very few people here in Ukraine who would take that announcement at face value. I think this is more about trying to make lesser demands, make a more manageable goal to then sell to the Russian public as a success, given what is arguably a fiasco in the rest of the country and Russia's failure to make significant progress in recent weeks. Going into this, you had messages from Moscow about being able to take Kiev in a matter of days rather than weeks, and that obviously hasn't happened. Indeed, there is a lot of fighting beyond Donbas, not just around me here in Kiev, 25 kilometers down the road in Irpin. The fighting continues, although it seems like the Ukrainians have been able to push back Russian forces quite significantly in some places near Kiev. In the south, around Mykolaiv and Kherson, is some news coming in today that even the Ukrainians were able to return to Kherson, which had been the one major Ukrainian city under full Russian control so far. So pretty difficult to really judge those carefully, because there aren't many journalists, independent journalists on the ground, but a sense that this is a war that is very much going on, and this is by no means the beginning of the end.
Nick, you've touched on it there, but does Russia's new focus on eastern Ukraine mean that the capital is off the hook? Do you think that Russian troops might fall back?
Well, we've seen that Ukrainian success east of the river, that supposedly Russian troops have been pushed back by quite some way. But on the other hand, just 20 kilometers direct line from where I'm standing now in downtown Kiev, they are still there, and we hear the shooting, we hear the artillery, some very big bangs this morning, quite close. I think that was Ukrainian anti-aircraft systems knocking some projectiles out of the sky. So this is very much still going on. Yes, people are getting used to it. There are kind of new routines. People are coming out in greater numbers, but it doesn't mean the danger isn't still there. We're having routine reports of residential buildings being hit, people being hurt. This is still going on, and the shooting and the artillery continues.
Well, another issue is what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky makes of Russia's shift in focus now. Today he addressed representatives from countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia at the Doha Forum. Let's have a listen.
This is also a question of abandoning the usage of Russian oil and gas. Responsible states, like the state of Qatar, are reliable and solid exporters of energy resources, and they can make their contribution to the stabilization in Europe. They can do much to restore justice. The future of Europe rests with your efforts. It depends on your efforts. I ask you to increase the output of energy to ensure that everyone in Russia understands that no country can use energy as a weapon and to blackmail the world.
Well, it appears like an attempt by President Zelensky to speed up the West's move away from Russian gas and oil. Nick, is that the case?
Definitely, and people here will tell you that since the beginning of the war in late February, a month ago, Europe alone has transferred about 20 billion euros to Russia for coal, for oil and gas. At the same time, Ukraine has received just about 4 to 5 billion. So you can see in terms of the kind of order of scale there, Russia getting a lot of money to pay for this military campaign. And obviously that is a priority here now in Ukraine. They say that the sanctions on Russian banks, on other Russian businesses is all well and good, but it's not enough. And to force the Kremlin to really stop this campaign, the only thing that will help now is an embargo and an immediate end to those transfers of huge amounts of hard currency.
Well, on the other hand, Russia has barely budged on its demands on Ukraine, including that Kyiv recognise the self-proclaimed republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. Is that a red line Zelensky is willing to cross, Nick?
I think for now it's a definite no. He's talked about maybe being open to some kind of deal over NATO membership. That's been an aspiration in Ukraine for some years now. That could be up on the table, but accepting the independence of those self-proclaimed republics, I think that is a no-go. Ukraine feeling that it is doing well and that success on the battlefield is being recognised by Western partners doesn't feel like it needs to make that kind of painful concession right now. And it's pretty hard to see why the Ukrainian public would agree to that kind of thing, would accept that kind of deal after so many deaths and so much suffering across the country in a situation where, unlike 2014, this country hasn't collapsed militarily and is still going in spite of a month of war.
DW correspondent Nick Connolly, thank you and take care. Well, I'm joined now by Raphael Loss from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Hi, Raphael. Good to have you here on DW. Now, the Russian military is now saying that phase one of the invasion is, quote, mostly complete and it'll now focus its war on the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Do you buy that, or has the shift been announced because of the failure to take the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv?
I think from what we can tell, Russian armed forces are definitely overstretched. Their supply lines are buckling under Ukrainian pressure. There is some danger of Russian troops being encircled by Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian armed forces have been able to mount limited counteroffensives in some areas. What I would caution of is from the statements that we've heard out of Moscow in the last couple of hours to assess that anything changes in Vladimir Putin's strategic goals. I think what we see is an operational reorganization to limit the exposure of Russian armed forces and to reprioritize goals as part of this campaign. But again, if they take the Donbass, there's nothing that would prevent them from returning to Kiev.
Raphael, how do you assess the change in strategy against the backdrop of domestic support in Russia for the invasion?
It's difficult to assess. One, we must recognize that the Kremlin has a tight grip on the Russian media ecosystem. It has consolidated authoritarian rule over the past couple of weeks, as well as the campaign against Ukraine has commenced. And that is a long-standing trend that Vladimir Putin has facilitated over the past 20 years since he's come to power in 2000. So I find it difficult to, one, rely on sort of public opinion polls that are coming out of Russia there. We need to recognize that often people are exposed to just one side of the story. But we also have to see that especially a lot of young people who have experience abroad are leaving Russia, and that the Russian economy in the long term is under a lot of pressure, particularly emerging technologies, startups, and so on and so forth, are relocating to outside of Russia.
Let's talk a little bit about President Putin. Could this be a potential face-saving move by him?
I think in the short term it might be, but as I said earlier, I think it would be wrong to assess that Vladimir Putin has moderated his goals vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think his rhetoric towards Ukraine as a nation, as a country, as a people, has been fairly consistent over the past couple of years. He's negated that there is such a thing as Ukrainian identity that is separate from a Russian identity. And so I think we need to recognize and prepare for a sort of longer-term pressure campaign against Ukraine and a longer-term pressure campaign against the West who's supporting Ukraine.
Now, US President Joe Biden is in Poland. Is he succeeding in keeping the NATO countries united?
I think he is, but that is something that is on the shoulders of the European NATO allies as well, Canada too, I think. What we've seen over the past couple of days in various Brussels meetings, from the G7 to the EU Council meeting to the NATO Council meeting, is a very unified West. There are some differences, I think, when it comes, for example, to energy sanctions. Germany is very reluctant there. Some other Eastern and allies and the United States have been putting some pressure on Berlin on this issue. But nevertheless, I think overall the picture that emerged from Brussels and that is now being re-emphasized in Poland by Biden and his Polish counterpart, Andrzej Duda, is one of unity. That is somewhat unexpected because if you recall, the American presidential election 2 years ago, then Poland was very much hoping for Donald Trump to return to the White House. And there was some disappointment when Joe Biden criticized Poland and Hungary together with Belarus for sort of creeping authoritarianism. But I think the current crisis has led to a rally around the flag effect within NATO, within the EU, a fairly united West.
Raphael Loss from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Aglaja Smetkov. She's a lecturer in international politics at University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Hi and welcome to DW. How do you read Russia's military change of focus, the claim that this war was always just about the Donbass, not about taking all of Ukraine or the capital, Kyiv?
Thank you for having me on. I mean, you clearly see a shift of strategies. The first time that the Russians have admitted that, the first phase is over. I think it's important to keep in mind that the number of strategies we've had up till now can almost count to sort of 3 or 4 different strategies. Because we've, once the initial invasion didn't happen over the first few days, the Russians then shifted towards having sort of 3-pronged approach of the east, Kyiv, and the south. That hasn't worked. And in the last sort of 2 weeks, essentially even the Russians have had to admit that they are being pushed back and essentially that the initial strategy has failed. Now, the strategy we can look at now does seem to be aiming to sort of connect eastern Ukraine with Crimea. So you essentially would have the flank from sort of Crimea to Zaporizhia to Donbass and to Russia. So you essentially have that flank that the Russians can then resupply sort of overland, and it's much more of a war sort of attrition from the Russian side.
Right, well, how stable is Vladimir Putin's regime in the face of what is seen as a military setback and massive international sanctions? Does he still retain the cooperation of important officials and military leaders?
So at this stage, we haven't seen much of sort of pushback against Putin. Now, we have to keep in mind that we are sort of back into the land of sort of criminology. So we have to watch and sort of look at what's going on because we don't have much information about what's going on inside the regime. In the country, it seems that most Russians see the sanctions and the effects that are happening on the ground. They're blaming that on the West that are wanting to destroy Russia. So they're not associating that with Putin's failure in Ukraine. They're very much associating that with sort of the West hating Russia. Now, there have been reports sort of the Russian defense minister, Shoigu, suffering from sort of heart problems. There have been sort of talk about potential sort of Putin regime going against some of their senior officials. We haven't seen that at this stage. So I think the support is still there, but there is a clear recognition, even at the senior level, that the original goals of the operation just haven't succeeded.
What about an opposition movement? Is there any sign that there is an opposition movement that could threaten Putin's grip?
I would say at this stage, no. So, of course, there have been mass demonstrations, protests, but at the same time, if we're looking at the opinion polls, although it's hard to gauge at the moment the sort of the opinion of the Russian public because of the draconian laws that have been put in place. It seems that at this stage we don't have mass pushback against the war. The Russian propaganda is still talking primarily in terms of what's going on in Donbass. They're talking primarily in terms of sort of Russian troops encountering Nazis in Ukraine, and they're also painting and characterizing, for example, events in Mariupol as Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian forces that are razing the city to the ground as they're retreating. And because the Russians are getting such different images about what's going on in Ukraine, a lot of the blame is sort of being laid at the West. And at the moment, we're not seeing much opposition when it comes to sort of senior ranks, at least not enough to potentially expect for a coup anytime soon. Of course, the situation is changeable and it might change, but it's just my assessment at this point.
What about Western political and military strategy? Do you think it's been adequate?
So President Biden has clearly been very set on creating red lines and ensuring that there is no active confrontation between NATO and Russia. And he has been adamant over the last month that these are his red lines. So, for example, he has reiterated that if the Russians use sort of nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, then NATO will get involved. That if the Russians in any way have incursions into the neighboring NATO countries, NATO will get involved. But he has sort of stuck by. Now, of course, from the Ukrainian side, they have argued that the lack of offensive weapons given over by the West is inadequate. And so the Ukrainian leadership has been trying to convince NATO and President Biden that they have to change their military support. But it seems at the moment this is not something that's on the cards. What has been much more effective is the sanctions that the West has put against Russia. And those have been much bigger than we've seen in the past. And I think they will have substantial impact domestically.
Dr. Aglaya Snetkov, thank you for joining us on DW.
Thank you.
Well, on his second day in Poland, US President Joe Biden is to deliver a speech on the crisis in Ukraine. The White House says the president will call on the free world to stand against Vladimir Putin. President Biden has arrived at the presidential palace in Warsaw, where he is holding talks with his Polish counterpart, Andrzej Duda. The two are set to discuss the situation in Ukraine with the West's military, humanitarian and economic response to the war on the agenda. Biden has also just met the Ukrainian foreign minister and defense minister in his first face-to-face talks with top Ukrainian officials since the war began. Well, for more, let's go to our correspondent, Barbara Wiesel, who's outside the presidential palace in Warsaw. Hi, Barbara. Good to see you. Now, President Biden is meeting with the Polish president. What can we expect from it?
Of course, we can expect that some of the things he talked about with the Ukrainian ministers, particularly the request for more and stronger and further-reaching weapons, will be also on the table here behind me. But if we take a little look around here, we can see that this visit of Joe Biden here in Warsaw is quite a sensation for local people. Many of them have come out to sort of watch the president walk into the presidential palace here, and of course they saw his whole security machinery and the Beast, the famous presidential limousine, which is now parked out of view, of course. And the two presidents are inside there. And after having sort of pushed to the side a bit of the political and diplomatic rubble that's in the past of those two presidents, because Andrzej Duda took his good time after recognizing the election victory of Joe Biden last time. They will really have to sort of come to the point, what more can the international community do in order to strengthen Ukrainian resistance against the invasion of Russia, and what more can they do also to sort of keep Ukraine strong and alive on the other side of the border, which is not that far from here, actually. So that is really the main point, and Poland is the leader in sort of pushing for stronger sanctions, for more measures against Russia.
Well, that actually brings me on to my next question. What exactly are they calling for if they want a tougher stance against Russia?
they've published a 10-point plan, and some parts of it are quite simple. For instance, prevent any Russian trade going through Belarus to the European Union, which is still taking place, and just close those borders. Cut off oil and gas immediately. Don't wait for another few months until the end of the year. Do it right now, because it's important to sort of hurt Russia economically right now. And sort of a string of other measures similar to that, really sort of on the economic side. Of course, a call for better and more weapons, a call for fighter jets for Ukraine in order to defend themselves against the Russians in the airspace. And finally, of course, it is the ongoing call of Poland to send in a humanitarian mission under international and NATO protection to evacuate the embattled regions, particularly in the southeast or areas like Mariupol, where civilians are really under siege conditions. And Poland says we can't look on, we really have to do something against it now, not in 3 months or in a half year.
Now, Joe Biden is set to deliver a speech as well, Barbara. What can we expect to hear from the US president?
Yeah, this is announced to be a sort of a speech that will set the ground for the further relations, of course, within NATO, for unity within the Western community. And he will also call, of course, for unity in standing up against what the United States call the battle between democracies and autocratic forces. And they see this as sort of a very basic and very as a matter of principle, really. They say we have to stand up to this, otherwise we will be weakened. This is a fight that is fought in Ukraine, that it concerns all of us, that really delineates the two sides here in the world, and it's like good and evil and black and white. It seems to be very strong in that regard from the little that we heard beforehand. So he's really wanting to set the ground for the next months and for the future of NATO and European Union and transatlantic relations, of course.
DW correspondent Barbara Wedel in Warsaw, thank you. Well, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. And with me here in studio is DW reporter William Glucroft. Good to see you, William. Now, this is a visit which could be described as a delicate balancing act for Joe Biden, considering the relations that we've seen between Poland and the United States. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, indeed. We heard a little bit about that from Barbara just now, that Poland is simultaneously the West's golden child and its black sheep. You know, we have on one hand this incredible amount of unity among Western countries, with Poland really at a leading position given its geographic proximity to Ukraine, and so important for NATO policy and helping Ukraine in all the various ways trying to defend against the Russian invasion. But at the same time, there's these long-standing issues between Poland and the European Union, between Poland and the United States. We've heard, as Barbara was saying, black and white. Poland shows how not black and white the issue of democracy is, because Joe Biden himself has accused Poland of slipping into authoritarianism, this democracy that's kind of losing some of its democratic liberal values. We saw this with its very conservative government and very closely aligned to the church in Poland, going up against abortion rights, LGBTQ plus rights. They've been going hard against an independent judiciary. That's the European Union's biggest beef with Poland, that has basically done away with the independent judiciary, which is so fundamental to democratic rule of law. And the EU has open cases against Poland, withholding funding from Poland as a punishment for violating European values, European Union rules. And Joe Biden is very much on that side, or tries to appear to be on the side of upholding these kinds of democratic values. And all of those things in the background should not be forgotten in light of all the unity we're seeing with NATO and all the unity we're seeing with supporting Ukrainian refugees, while at the same time you have Poland keeping out refugees from places like Iraq and Afghanistan. We saw the big crisis on the border with Belarus at the end of last year, which the European Union called blackmail. Belarus trying to blackmail the European Union with using refugees as a weapon. So we're seeing very contrasting pictures that Joe Biden needs to try to thread very carefully.
Now, we've seen an almost unprecedented show of unity among Western allies, and we've also seen some huge shifts in policy. We don't really need to look too far, because It's been quite apparent here in Germany, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Germany was criticized for dragging its feet for so long, years really, and being too close to Russia, too close to the tastes of many of its European allies, especially in the Baltics and Poland, always berating Germany for being too friendly to Putin, for giving him too much of the benefit of the doubt. And now they're saying, look what happened. We were right. It wasn't just merely our post-Cold War, post-communist paranoia. We had a case to be made. And Germany has really made this 180 turn, this Zeitenwende, this turning point in history by committing huge amounts of money to defense spending. Germany, we know from its history how hesitant it is to use military might. Now it looks like it's on the verge of having by far the largest defense budget in the European Union. That's just one way that we're seeing Germany really turning a dime here, but how much of that is really going to come to fruition? We still have to see. It's a very long way out as the political processes take their toll.
DW reporter William Ducroft, thanks for that analysis.